Welcome back. We left off last time with an exercise regarding the Blender interface. We saw how we can save the default file so that every time we open a new file we will have the interface we customized. We also saw that in the File Default Load Factory Settings menu we have the ability to reload the original state of Blender. If you followed my advice and experimented, you might find that every time you reopen Blender, you still have the file saved by you. What you will have to do is, yes, call up Load Factory Settings, but immediately afterwards, once you call up the startup file, click on File Default and resave the startup file again. By doing this, the next time you reopen Blender, you will again have the default starting situation as standard. Today we are going to look at Blender's preferences together for the first time. Let's take a quick look at the options that are made available to us to understand the different possibilities that are made available to us to customize Blender. To bring up the preferences window, let's go to the Edit Preferences menu. Here's where a new window appears that, unlike the others we've seen so far, overlays the Blender interface. We noticed in the last lesson how we can move a window left or right, up or down, however no window overlaps with the other one. In this case, however, the Preferences window can be moved freely also, because then, once we have changed the options that interest us, we will close it again to continue working. Of course, if we have a second monitor, no one prevents us from using it to keep this window open. We see that on the left we have a list of buttons that allow us to move from one section to another of the preferences. Here are really a lot for the moment. We will see them very quickly. But as we go deeper into the study of Blender, we will go into individual topics. Let's start at the beginning, the interface. We see that on the right-hand side, the various options change. The options are divided into sections. We have Display, Editor, Translation, Text Rendering, and Menu. By clicking on this little arrow, we can open or close each section. The interesting thing about Blender is that we can also click and drag to go and open all the windows consecutively. This we can find in other parts of the interface. Another thing that we find here, but also in other parts of the interface, is the ability to rearrange the layout of the sections, and we can do that here on the right. See these dots? They indicate to us the possibility of grabbing and then pulling with the mouse cursor. Let's give it a try. We click and drag. You see the window moves and allows us to go and move the position of the section. At first you might say it doesn't have much use, but this shows us once again that Blender is highly customizable. So if it will be convenient for us to have a certain option there immediately in the front row, well, we could tell Blender that we want it there. This also and especially serves the purpose of being able to speed up repetitive operations. Now you are just learning to use Blender for the first time, but as time goes on you will get better and better and faster. And if one day Blender becomes your work tool, you will understand that speed matters a great deal, especially when doing very complex work. Knowing keyboard abbreviations, moving different sections of a menu can really come in handy. We were saying here we have the display section. We have the ability to change the resolution of the interface. Right now the factor is 1, so it is scaled to 100%. However, we have the possibility, for example, if we work with very large monitors or with high resolutions, to increase the size of the icons. For example, if I press 2, you see everything is enlarged because I have doubled the size of all the graphical elements of the interface. Of course, I can also set intermediate values or even values less than 1. If, for example, I write 0.5, everything becomes very small with a dubious usefulness. However, once again, we see how we can really customize everything or almost everything of our interface. We have the ability to set the thickness of the lines, default thin, thick. We have the ability to enable or disable the splash screen when we turn on Blender. We have the ability to enable additional features for programmers. This we will not see in this basic course. However, if you feel like exploring it too. So, we have the ability to enable tooltips, these little windows that go open when we go to move the mouse cursor over a particular button. Let's take an example. Now I move the mouse arrow over the interface button and this little box comes up informing me of the contents of what I'm going to click on. In addition, if I also select Python tooltip to the box on the button information, I also get added the reference to the function in Python that is called by doing that particular action. With this option, if you are a programmer, you will find out very quickly how to invoke virtually any type of command. It is very interesting. Let's move on. Now we won't see the whole thing. Let's just give a quick overview. Here we see that temporary editors are created in a new window, for example, when we launch a render, just as the Blender Preferences window is opened. Also in the case of the render, a new window is opened. This is an option that you can change, and so also for the file browser. When we go to save a file, for example, we saw this in the last lesson, opens a separate window that momentarily overlays the Blender interface. Status bar is this bottom bar in which we see by default the version of Blender, but we can also add additional information, for example, statistics about the scene. Enabling them brings up all this additional information, the duration of our animation, and the memory usage by the system. In future lessons, you may happen to use these statistics about the number of vertices, faces, triangles, and so if you would like to enable them as well, you will find them here in the interface status bar section. Then we have the translation section. In this section, we can go and change the language of the interface. Blender is translated into many languages, including Italian. However, the lessons in this course will always be done with the English interface. Now let's move on to the theme section. Here we can decide the color of every single element of the Blender interface. There is really to get lost in. If you feel like venturing in anyway, you know that you do no harm. You know how to reset everything. We have already seen it in the previous lessons, and still very interesting. You see, for every single editor, we have all the various sections, all the various portions of the interface, and for each of them we have the corresponding color. There is really hours to be lost in it if you want to customize everything. One very nice thing is the ability to save or use presets. Right now I am using Blender Dark, however we have the possibility to use Blend Light, for example, or Deep Gray. If you will see on YouTube tutorials with different colors, probably the person who recorded them used a different theme than the default one, which is just Blender Dark. Personally, I will always use this one, however, nobody forbids you to use the one you prefer. If you come from other software, for example Maya, you have the possibility to use this coloring, which should make you feel a little bit more at home. Moving on, there is viewport. Again, we have different settings. Try, for example, to turn some of these options on or off. Object info, you see you turn this on and off. View name, same thing. So we can also decide not to show anything. Do some experimentation, of course. Instead, let's move on now to see a very important section, which is the add-on section. Blender is a vast software, maybe I have already told you, but I will tell you again. But it doesn't end there. Already it's a whole world to discover. However, you should know that there is the possibility to add new elements to Blender, i.e. add-on programs that add functionality to Blender. By default, there are a lot of them installed already, but we have the possibility to install additional ones downloaded from the internet made by different programmers. Here we see all the installed add-ons, and the ones that have a check mark are also enabled. For example, this add-on is used to be able to import and export FBX format. Later in the course of the lessons, if we need a particular add-on, this is where we will need to come to activate it or possibly install it. In the input section, we have the ability to emulate the numeric keypad on the keyboard and also emulate the 3-button mouse. This is in cases where you do not have them available. However, I recommend that in order to work well in Blender, you should have an extended keyboard, so with the numeric keypad as well, and a 3-button mouse. So right key, left key, and the little wheel that is used as the third key. However, if you do not have them available, know that here, in this section, you can enable their emulation. You see, we have the possibility to set also some details about the use of the tablet, touchpad, and so on. Another very important section is the list of keyboard abbreviations. In Blender, we have all the menus that are accessible with the various buttons, the drop-down menu items. Within the editors, we find all the various options. However, know that to work well, to work fast, it is very important to learn keyboard abbreviations. This will allow you not only to work faster, but you will also not have the need to remember where that particular command is, in which menu, in which submenu. Having the keyboard abbreviation in your head means immediately recalling what you need. So during the lessons, I will repeat these abbreviations to you over and over again because it will be really helpful to learn them. Here, in this section, you can customize them, although I sincerely advise against it at this stage. As long as you are taking the basic course, I would keep the default abbreviations. Look, there are so many of them, and one very important thing is to remember that because we have multiple windows in the Blender interface that contain different editors, each editor will have its own keyboard abbreviations. So if a keyboard abbreviation maybe will call a certain command within the 3D viewport, it is not necessarily the case that the same command will be called, for example, in the outliner. So, depending on where the mouse cursor will be, their Blender will know what keyboard abbreviation it needs to use to invoke a given command. Let's take an example. I hold the mouse inside the 3D viewport. If I press the G key, I call the grab command to move the cube. However, we will see this better later. If I move inside the outliner window and press the G key, this does not happen because the G abbreviation has no effect. It is not provided inside the outliner. So always remember to check where the mouse cursor is. Let's go back to our preferences. Let's go to the system. Here we have the option to set the video card as well. I am right now, using an Apple computer with the Intel processor that uses metal technology. By selecting this option, we see that we can choose which video cards to use. Blender suggests that I use the MD Radeon Pro that is included in my laptop. I could also activate the processor and have both the video card and the CPU working at the same time. In this case, an i9. It is not necessarily the case that activating all the options at the same time will make our computer faster, more performant in final rendering. Do some testing if necessary. The last section we look at today, which is also very important, is the section that allows us to determine what the file paths are. For example, where the fonts are located, where the textures are located, the sound files, the temporary files, and so on. So this is where you can go to indicate Blender where to go to fish for different resources. Once we've changed one or more preferences, we'll have the option to save them with the appropriate button that we have here in the bottom left-hand corner. Although actually by default, Blender always saves them anyway. We can see it from this menu that we have here on the left, this button with these three little lines. If we click it, you see that a menu pops up, and there is as the first option autosave, which by default is enabled. So what does that mean? That every time we go to change an option within the Blender preferences, it will be saved automatically. However, we have the option to recall the default factory preferences or save them manually if the autosave option is turned off. Well, for this lesson, that's all. I remind you, if you haven't already done so, to subscribe to the channel. If you like, you can also subscribe, and in the video description, you can find the link to the handouts that will contribute to the publication of these and future lessons. As always, I thank you for following me, and I will see you again soon.